Good morning, third grade champions. Yesterday we started a new book, The Puppy Place, and we're going to continue that today. And I'm really excited to have this new book with you. We're going to start on page 13. Page 13 of The Puppy Place, it's chapter 2. Steve sat back on his haunches and looked up at Charles. Puppy tracks? Charles nodded. They look exactly like the tracks my puppy, Buddy, makes after a snowstorm. Well, after all, foxes are related to dogs, aren't they? Dad asked. So maybe. Steve held up a hand. I think Charles might be right. When I look more closely, I can see that these tracks are rounder and a little bigger than fox tracks. And see how the trail meanders, he pointed. It wanders all over the place, here, there, and everywhere. Fox trails tend to move straight in one direction. Foxes are always on a mission. But what would a puppy be doing all the way out here in the woods? Charles asked, and Steve nodded. Right, you wouldn't expect that, he said. As a matter of fact, that reminds me that some of my neighbors have been talking about a young stray they've been seeing this winter. I saw my friend Adelaide at the post office the other day, and she said she thought the pup had been living in her barn for a while. Maybe he's decided to drop in on me now. Wow, said Charles, but he spun around in a circle, almost falling over his own snowshoes. Then he threw his arms out at the endless woods. Where would he be? He could be anywhere out here. Do you think he's okay? It's cold out and he must be hungry. We have to try to find him and help him. Charles saw Steve look at Dad, his eyebrows raised. Dad grinned and reached out to pat Charles on the back. That's my boy, he told Steve. Charles can't stand to see or even hear about a dog in trouble. Steve nodded seriously. You've got a big heart, Charles. Tell you what, we've got a few more buckets of sap to collect, and as soon as we're done, we'll see if we can find that pup, okay? Reluctantly, Charles nodded. He did not want to wait 1 minute to look for the dog, but he wasn't in charge. He followed Dad and Steve down the trail, lagging behind a bit as he watched for more puppy tracks in the snow. There! He stopped to take a closer look. Nope. These tracks were totally different. They were tinier, and he could see the mark of a tail that had been dragging along. Plus, these tracks led straight to a tree trunk, then disappeared as if the animal had climbed right up. Probably a squirrel, thought Charles. Dad and Steve had stopped up ahead in a small grove of trees. Charles could hear them talking as they emptied buckets. He looked back at the spot where he'd first seen the puppy tracks. Maybe he could just follow the trail a little way and find out where the puppy had gone. He looked at Dad and Steve again. They picked up their blue buckets and began to hike slowly up the trail, still talking. Dad was so busy catching up with his old friend that he hadn't even noticed that Charles wasn't with them. Charles didn't stop to think about it. He turned around on the trail and headed back the way they'd come. When he got to the place where the puppy tracks crossed, he stooped down to take a closer look. Which way was the puppy headed? He could see the shape of the puppy's paw outlined perfectly in the new snow, right down to the toenails. It was clear that the dog had been headed toward a cluster of pine trees off to Charles' left. He stared into the dark, thick woods. Maybe the puppy was right over there, watching him. It would only take a minute or two to check. He looked back over his shoulder at Dad and Steve. They were still hiking slowly up the trail, still talking. Charles stepped off the snowshoe path and began to follow the tracks. Steve was right. The trail did meander, heading this way and that. Meander, Charles said under his breath as he followed the tracks. That was a new word for him, and it was a good one. Charles liked to put words like that into his back pocket and pull them out in the middle of a conversation. He loved seeing the look on his mom's face when he did that. The other day when Buddy was barking and running around the house, Charles had said that Buddy was being obstreperous. Mom had looked surprised, then burst out laughing. Charles smiled, remembering. Then he realized he'd lost the trail because he wasn't paying attention. He retraced his steps and picked it up again as the tracks meandered from tree to tree. He even found a place where the puppy had peed against a tall pine. Just like Buddy, he said aloud, thinking of the way his puppy always had to sniff every bush and tree before he picked out the one he wanted. Thinking of Mom and Buddy made Charles miss them both. They seemed very far away right then as he stood alone in the middle of the snowy woods. Even Dad and Steve seemed pretty far away. Charles took a deep breath, which helped to undo the sudden lump in his throat, and kept walking. The day seemed darker when Charles entered the piney grove where the puppy's tracks led. He had to squint to see the trail and push heavy snow-laden branches out of his way in order to follow the tracks. Charles saw a spot where the puppy had stopped to scrape away some snow. Maybe he'd smell something interesting there, and then continued on. The tracks kept going, and Charles kept pushing forward until he popped into a small clearing near a stone cliff that had moss growing all over it, even now in winter. It was pretty. The way snow trickled down the bright green moss and made it shine. But Charles knelt down and looked more closely to be sure. The tracks seemed to head directly for the cliff, then disappear. A puppy couldn't walk straight up that steep rock face. Where had he gone? As Charles knelt, he heard a tiny whisper. He heard a tiny whimper, then another. He peered along the bottom of the cliff until he spotted a dark triangle where there was an opening in the rock. The tracks led right to it. "Hello," Charles said. He listened carefully and heard another soft whimper in reply. Slowly, he crawled forward. "Puppy, are you in there?" Then he stopped, frozen in his tracks, wondering all of a sudden whether Steve had been right in the first place. Maybe those tracks really had been made by a fox. And maybe the fox was holed up in this little cave, just where a fox belonged. On the one hand, Charles thought he would really love to see a fox, a flash of red fur and a long, thick tail in the middle of these snowy, piney woods. But on the other hand, were foxes nice or were they scary? Did foxes bite? What would happen if a fox suddenly ran out of that tiny, dark cave straight at Charles? We're going to stop there, boys and girls, on page 20, and I'll see you tomorrow, and hopefully we can finish this chapter and start another chapter of this great book, The Puppy Place. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye.